Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Alison Green in Washington, D.C. Alison is a career and management advice columnist at the Ask a Manager website. She also writes columns for U.S. News & World Report, Fast Company, Money Magazine, and Inc. And she's the author of Managing to Change the World, the Nonprofit Manager's Guide to Getting Results. Alison, thank you for joining me today.
Angela, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. We talked just for a second before we got started. And how long have you been doing this for? You know, you write a lot of advice on this particular sort of genre about job searching and sort of career advice in general. How long have you been doing it?
I have been writing Ask a Manager for 9 years, since 2007, which is crazy because when I started it, I thought it would last maybe 6 months tops. I didn't think there would be enough content to keep it going. So it's been surprising and really cool that 9 years later I'm still doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so one really interesting part about your background is that you were, a hiring manager, and so you write about that topic in particular. And very often as a candidate, we often think about how nervous we are to be interviewed, but then on the other side of the table, what's it like to be the hiring manager? What should we know, that hiring managers are going through in this process?
Yeah, this is so important for candidates to understand because I think so often on the job candidate side of things, people are thinking of the interview or thinking of their interviewer as this sort of skeptical adversary. And it's true that a good interviewer will have some healthy skepticism, but it's not generally an adversarial thing or something where your interviewer is looking to trip you up. I can tell you from the interviewer side of things, we're going into every interview hoping that the person we're about to talk to is going to be the person we want to hire. If you think about it, it makes sense. We've got this annoying problem, this job vacancy. And so we're hoping you're going to be the answer to that problem so that we can hire you and turn our attention back to our actual jobs. So most interviewers are going into that conversation hoping that you're going to be great, which I think is so easy to overlook when you're in the anxiety-producing spot of the person being interviewed. But I think a better way to think about it, and certainly the way most good hiring managers are thinking about it, is as a business conversation. We're trying to figure out, does a business relationship with this person make sense? It's not about your worth as a person or anything like that, but I think sometimes job seekers end up feeling that way.
No, absolutely. It's interesting too, because sometimes we get called in for interviews where maybe we don't quite meet all of the requirements, and we go into that in-person interview assuming, gosh, they're never going to pick me because obviously I'm not qualified. From a hiring manager's perspective, would you invite someone to come in who you didn't at all think could possibly pass the interview?
No. Interviewing people is a pain, and it takes up a huge amount of time. There's just no reason for a rational hiring manager to interview someone who they don't think is qualified. So if you have been called for the interview, even if you don't 100% match all of their job requirements, that is because they think that you could be the person who they think you're plausible. They think you could be the person they end up hiring. And I think, too, job seekers tend to be very black and white about this stuff. Either they match all the requirements, and so therefore they think they're an excellent candidate, and they're surprised if they don't get hired, or they don't match them all, and so they think that they suck as a candidate, and there's no way that they'll be hired. And it's really in between. People get interviewed and hired all the time without being a perfect line-for-line match with what's in the job ad. The job ad is more like a wish list. It's sort of the composite of what the ideal candidate might look like. But I would bet more often than not, the majority of hires actually aren't perfect matches.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. Well, so when we're going through the process to actually interview as a candidate, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen us make, as the hiring manager?
The biggest one, and I see it just over and over, is forgetting to figure out if you even want the job and if you think you'd be good at it. And I think what happens a lot is that candidates are so focused on getting a job offer that they lose sight of the fact that that's not really the goal. And the goal should be to get a job that you'll be good at and that you'll be happy in over the long term. And if you have your whole focus on convincing that person to hire you, you can miss really important signals about whether it's even the right job for you or the right organization for you. So you really want to spend time interviewing your interviewer right back. You don't want to just wait for them to deliver a verdict about you. You want to be gathering information about the job and about the manager and the company culture, so you can figure out, is it somewhere that you're going to be happy in? Is it a job that you're going to thrive in? The bonus of that is that not only is it useful for you to do that so you can make a good decision, but it actually means you're going to come across better to your interviewer, because they want to see that you're not just focused on getting any old job offer, but on learning about this particular job to make sure it's one you want. Because I would much rather have you figure out now in the interview that it's not right for you and opt out, rather than figure it out after I've hired you and trained you and put resources into you.
No, absolutely. You're completely right. I often compare it to sort of dating. When we go on a first date, we don't just sit there and hope that the other person on the other side of the table will marry us. We're trying to get to know them and decide, is this a mutual fit? It's not just a one-way street.
Exactly. I think it's a lot like dating too, and I love that comparison. And if you ever have been on a date with someone who just seems focused on trying to win you over, and you can tell that that's really their only goal, and they're not trying to really get to know you and figure out if it's a good fit, it's really a turnoff. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true in interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing it makes me think of, you mentioned, figuring out if it's the right fit, in general. I believe it's, and you probably know, I think it's Zappos.com that maybe offers new hires money, like a new employee, they offer them money, I think, to quit pretty early on to see, if they really want to be there. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I've heard that about them. I think it's so interesting, and I love the idea. I don't know enough about the mechanics of how it plays out in practice, but I love the idea of making it safe and easy for someone to walk away if they don't think it's the right role or they're not enthusiastic about it. It's better for everyone if there's an easy, safe way to just get that out there and then figure out how to move forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so one thing that comes up during the interview process sometimes are these really awkward questions that we get, which happen to be illegal. And I can tell you, the last time I interviewed for a full-time job, I was asked, are you married? Do you have any children? Do you plan to have any children soon? And anyway, I just love, your advice on how we as job seekers can handle these kinds of illegal questions, without burning a bridge, to the person who's asking them.
Yeah, so it's crazy that people are still in this day and age asking things like that. I will say, it's important to know, and a lot of people don't know this, is that in most cases the act of asking the question itself is not illegal. What is illegal is making a job decision based on it. So they can ask the question, they just can't do anything with the information. So in light of that, there's really no point in them asking. Smart employers won't ask because they know they can't use the information. And they know that asking is going to make a lot of candidates really uncomfortable for good reasons. There is one exception to that, which is questions about disabilities. They aren't allowed to ask about disabilities at all. But other than that, they can ask. They just can't do anything with it. But as far as how to handle it, if you do end up getting asked one of these questions, marital status or religion or kids, I would say if it seems like it's honestly just like an innocent social pleasantry, which sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but sometimes it really is. And if that's your sense, you're probably better off answering it in that spirit if you're comfortable doing it. But if you get the sense that they're trying to get information that they will then use in their hiring decision, like if they ask whether you have kids in the context of talking about the hours that you'd be working, and you get the sense that they think maybe parenthood is going to prevent you from working the type of hours that they need, in that case, I'd say, think about what they're really asking and answer that question instead. So leave the kids out of it and instead, in that case, speak to whether you can work the hours they need. So you might say, I understand what the schedule is and I'd have no problem committing to it. There's nothing that would interfere with my ability to work those hours. So you can kind of think about, what are they really getting at? What's the underlying worry? And maybe speak to that instead. there are certainly times when that strategy doesn't work. I mean, if you think that you're interviewing somewhere that's very socially conservative and doesn't want to hire married women with children at all, I mean, that's obviously a completely different issue, and it's going to raise questions about whether you even want to work in that culture. But in most cases, you can get away with that earlier strategy that I described.
No, I think that's great feedback. It kind of reminds me of, like a politician on television when you see them and they're asked a question that they don't quite want to answer the exact question, but so they'll say something sort of related, or, they'll sort of, divert the attention a little bit is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
That's exactly right. You're answering the version of the question that you want to answer.
Yeah, and it kind of protects you a little bit, I think, in a way, and I think in a lot of cases that hiring manager will probably just take the information and keep moving.
That's right. And if they really keep pushing and they're persistent, that's a red flag. And that goes back to the importance of you assessing them right back. I mean, they're giving you pretty valuable information about themselves at that point. And I would say think about what you're learning from this person with the fact that they keep pushing it so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So once the job interview is complete, one next step is following up. And I think that this is actually a topic that you've written about. I think you mentioned, the fine line between being, sort of admirable in your approach and being considered sort of annoying, having annoying persistence. Can you kind of give us some guidelines on how we can follow up after an interview and be admirable versus annoying?
Yes. So people really struggle with this. The first thing is that at the end of your interview, before you leave, always ask what their timeline is and when you can expect to hear something back. Because otherwise, if you don't ask and they don't volunteer it, you're going to spend days sitting in your house wondering why your phone hasn't rung and what does it mean that it hasn't rung, and is this really a silent rejection? Have you been ghosted? That's a lot of agony and stress that that hopefully you want to avoid. So ask what their timeline is. That doesn't mean they're going to stick to it. An awful lot of the time they won't. But by having some kind of timeline set in your head, that way you don't have to wonder, should I have heard something? Should I be reaching out? Then, if that timeline passes and you haven't heard anything, I would wait a week. Frankly, I would wait 2 if you can manage it, but people can't always stomach that. So wait a week or 2 after that timeline has passed, and then check in and say you just want to see if they have an updated timeline for making a decision. Yeah. But beyond that, I wouldn't do much more, or you do risk being annoying.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. What about, so sometimes, say they turn us down for the job, but, we really had a connection. Do you ever recommend keeping in touch with the people that you interviewed with, even if it didn't turn into a job offer?
Yeah, I definitely do, especially if you had a particular rapport. I mean, at a minimum, I would say send a nice note and tell them how much you enjoyed talking to them, and if there were things that particularly impressed you about their company or the interviewer herself, say that. I mean, people are human, and they like getting that kind of feedback and having that kind of connection made. Connect with them on LinkedIn if that's something that you're into doing. But yeah, I mean, at this point, they're a business contact like any other, and there's no reason that you can't continue to stay in touch. And sometimes there can be real advantages to doing that.
Oh, I totally agree. And you mentioned earlier that oftentimes candidates look at things as black and white, but there are many times, like you said, it can turn into a business contact. There could have been a reason that you weren't hired that had nothing to do with how qualified you were for the job,
That's right. Or maybe you weren't the right fit for that one, but you will be the right fit for something that opens up in 5 months. And if you stay on their radar and you handle yourself gracefully, you might be the first person they think of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely have had that happen. I can speak to say that's absolutely a possibility. Well, so you also mentioned earlier the idea of ghosting. And, for our listeners, obviously, that's also very similar to dating in terms of what people experience. Is sometimes you're going through dates and suddenly the person just doesn't call you again because they've kind of moved on. One of the most frustrating parts, actually, of job searching for job seekers is that companies do the same thing and they just kind of stop, calling candidates. So can you help us to understand, why do companies do this? Like, why do they just stop communicating?
Yeah, it's really rude, and it's also really common. I think sometimes employers do genuinely mean to get back to people, and then they just get sidetracked with other things. sometimes they're waiting until they've made the hire. They've offered the job to someone and that person has accepted, and they have a policy that they don't get back to any of their other candidates until that happens. And then enough time has gone by that they just end up not doing it. And others just don't think they have to. It's inexcusably rude. These are people who have probably taken time off work and put time into preparing for the interview, and it's just so rude. It's also really, really common. So from the job seeker side of things, it's better for your peace of mind to just know that this is a thing that happens, to not agonize if you haven't heard back, and to just try to mentally move on, and then let it be a pleasant surprise if they do contact you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to just let it go. I think it's the most difficult for job seekers who have been out of the job searching market for a very long time, because you may not be aware that this is kind of considered normal at this point.
Yeah, I get a lot of letters from people who are just shocked by it. And I mean, as they should be. It's genuinely shocking behavior. But I think if you haven't been job searching for a while, it is a rude awakening to see that companies do that. Yeah,
it's a real bummer. I really wish companies would kind of rethink this whole experience. It's, I think they're turning away future candidates, people who might fit in other roles, but the person becomes so offended that they probably would never consider that company again.
It is really outrageous. I have sort of a burning anger about this, particularly because, anyone who's ever job searched themselves, as do everyone who's making these decisions at these companies, they've all been job seekers. They know how much it sucks to be waiting to hear back about a job that you really want, that you put time into interviewing for. It's unkind and it's callous and inconsiderate, and it's not a problem that takes that much energy to solve. It is very easy to send out automated rejections to people. It's not, the barrier to doing this is not high, so there's no excuse for not doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even mentioned the time it takes a candidate to go through the process. Oftentimes, we bought a new suit, we revised our resume, we wrote a new cover letter, maybe we took a day off work, or we snuck out of work, we, went to the doctor, and we really put a lot of time into both phone interviews and in-person interviews, and then all of a sudden we just don't hear anything. It's really frustrating. Well, on the flip side, occasionally we do get a good offer or we get a job offer. And from your perspective, first of all, should we be negotiating when we get job offers? I know that's an area that people have a lot of questions about.
Yes, you should always negotiate. Well, almost always. There are some exceptions, like if the company immediately meets the number that you had asked for earlier in the process. Asking for more at that point is usually going to look like bad faith, but that's usually not what people are wondering about. People are wondering about more generally, should they negotiate? And yes, often you'll get more just by one or two sentences asking for it, which is pretty easy money, and it is certainly easier than most raises that you'll get once you're already working there. I think sometimes people worry that if they try to negotiate, what if the employer is somehow offended and pulls the offer? But that's really, really rare. It generally doesn't happen, and if it does happen, it's either that you are really inappropriately aggressive in the way that you did it, or the employer is really unreasonable. And in that case, you've dodged a bullet, because they are probably unreasonable about all sorts of other things too. But the vast majority of the time, it is normal to negotiate. You should do it, and you might really easily get more money from it.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any maybe sample language or anything that you'd recommend? Say we get a job offer that's pretty good, but the only thing is it pays a little bit less than what we really needed or we wanted. How do you open the door to that conversation?
Yeah, so this can actually be really simple. I think people sometimes envision that they'll have to build this whole elaborate case for it. Sometimes you do, but that's actually pretty rare. More often than not, you can just say something like, I was hoping that you could go up to X. Is that possible? Or, do you have any flexibility on the salary? I was hoping for X. And that's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. It doesn't have to be this big elaborate thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, so when people ask, just as a general guideline, I know this is kind of just throwing numbers out there, but say, out of 10 times, if someone asks for more, how often do you think they get at least a little something more?
Oh, gosh. So I don't have actual data on this.
Yeah, sure.
Anecdotally, a lot. That's not very quantifiable, I realize. A lot. I can say from my own personal experience, when people have asked, I'm almost always able to bump it up at least a couple thousand. Trying to think if I have anything that's more definitive than that. I mean, there is absolutely a possibility that the answer will be no, but the employer isn't going to be offended or outraged that you asked. There's really nothing to lose by making the request.
Yeah, I had a hiring manager tell me once that she basically never ever starts with her highest number because she needs to be prepared in the event that the person does ask for more.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, I've certainly done that myself, and there's a real practical argument for doing that because people are often going to ask for more, and it's nice to be able to say yes. On the other hand, it tends to overall depress salaries among women and minorities who studies show are less likely to ask, and so then you end up in a situation where the people asking are men, white men, and so they end up in the aggregate having higher salaries, which is not the way that you want to handle your salary structure. So I think when I'm advising managers now, I tend to push them away from doing that, but I certainly understand the appeal.
Yeah, completely. It's also interesting. I completely agree with you regarding the salary difference issue and all of that. What I've kind of noticed through coaching with folks is, at least in my coaching practice, which it's kind of a tiny segment of the overall job seekers, but I found that that very few people overall are negotiating, that many people, regardless of their background, feel uncomfortable. And so sometimes it makes me, I almost wish I could be a fly on the wall and see what the initial offers were that everyone was offered, because I wonder how much that even may contribute to the difference in pay that we see. But that's very anecdotal. That's just...
No, I agree. I always think it's interesting how often people don't ask for more. And it's tough in the hiring manager's position when you're silently thinking, like, go ahead and ask me for more because I could get it for you.
Completely. It's funny. I know, at least for myself, the very first job that I had, I worked for General Motors, and my parents actually discouraged me from negotiating relocation. Like, that's the one thing I really wanted. And they said, that would be embarrassing. Don't embarrass us. Don't ask for that. And I did not. And then the very first day I was there, I think we had sort of like an orientation, and everyone was kind of comparing notes with each other. And I learned that I was the only person in the whole room that hadn't received relocation. And that was the last time I did not negotiate.
Yeah. The parental advice can help or it can hurt. I mean, sometimes they're dealing with norms from different fields or from just a different time period. So they are always well-meaning, usually always well-meaning, but it doesn't always apply, which is tough because, especially early in your career, you're used to being able to rely on your parents' advice.
No, I completely agree. I know, like in my case, my parents did not come from a sort of corporate background. So on my first day of work, I remember being told, when you get there, because I worked, at an assembly plant, I was told, you'll have a locker and I got this description from my family that was very sort of blue collar, and which is fine. But I got there and I was working as an engineer, and I had a desk and I worked in an office, and there was no locker, so you're kind of, like you said, you're taking information from different sort of areas.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, you want to feel like the people who have always been the ones advising you are still able to do it. And it's unsettling, I think, early in your career if you realize, we have different frames of reference on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now, at least at this point in time, it's also very hard, at least from what I've seen generationally, and maybe you can kind of speak to this, but what I see is younger people who are being advised by their parents to stay at the same job for a very long time and to retire, versus the norm now seems to be to shift a little more often and actually, and to have more diversity on your resume. So there seems to be a little bit of tension between those two schools of thought. I don't know are you seeing that at all?
Yes, I definitely see that. And I think part of it is parents from older generations are just used to different norms. I mean, it used to be much more common to stay at one company your whole career, and it's pretty rare to see that these days. So that's part of it. I think the other part is that parents are always driven by wanting their kids to make the safest choices. And the idea of just settling somewhere and hunkering down and staying there is probably very appealing from a safety perspective.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I actually spoke to a job seeker last week who has been switching, every, like, say, let's 2 or 3 years. And this particular job seeker was very concerned that there would be a bias, negative bias, because they had been switching, every few years or so. But I don't know, what do you think is sort of an acceptable number of years at this point?
Yeah, it depends on the field. I mean, for most of the jobs that I hire for these days, if it was really a switch every 2 or 3 years, that would start to worry me, because I'm going to assume they're only going to stay with me for 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm hiring for more senior, more specialized positions where people are really just getting good at the job 2 years in, so I don't want them just staying a year after that and then leaving.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, more junior positions, it's not even just junior versus senior. I think it really depends on the field. There are fields where it is more normal to move around that frequently. So I think you have to know the norms of your field. The danger comes in, I think, when, similar to what you were saying about parents, when you start getting advice from someone who is coming at it from a different frame of reference. So if you talk to someone who's in advertising, where maybe it really is normal to move around every couple of years, but you're in a field where employers are looking for more longevity and stability, you don't want to take advice from someone in a different field on this one. So you really want to know what the norms are for the type of work that you're doing.
No, absolutely. So also back to the whole sort of job offer negotiation thing, I think I saw something on your website where you were talking about, when you negotiate for extra vacation and maybe like you negotiated your extra vacation with the hiring manager, and then maybe someone else came in and replaced them, and maybe the next person was less likely to want to honor that extra vacation. Do you have any tips for when we do negotiate extra vacation, what we should do?
Yes, get it in writing. They can still change it. They can't change it retroactively. They could change it going forward, but they are a lot less likely to change it if you have it in writing. A lot of times people make these arrangements sort of informally, and then the manager who okayed it leaves, and the next person either doesn't want to honor it, or there's been some miscommunication about exactly what was agreed to. If you have it in writing, and it doesn't have to be like a formal contract, which frankly they're probably not going to be willing to do because most people in the U.S. don't work with contracts, it can just be an email. It can just be like an email summarizing, here's what we agreed to. And it won't 100% guarantee it, but it will make the likelihood of that arrangement being honored in the long term a lot more likely.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's really great advice. Well, so say we get a job, we're at this new company where we're working, and in a few years, we're ready to get a raise at our existing company. We don't want to go to a new company. What tips do you have for us on how to get a raise within our existing company?
Yeah, so, the main thing is you want to have a sustained track record of accomplishment that you can point to. A raise is, at its core, it's recognition that you're now contributing at a much higher level than the last time that your salary was set. So you want to make sure that that's true, and then you want to show it. And so to do that, it really just, this is sort of like what I was saying about asking for a higher salary when you're a new hire. It doesn't have to be a whole long thing. You don't have to present like a 5-page bound case for why you should get a raise. It can really just be like a pretty casual conversation about your achievements in the last year or so and the impact that you've had, things you've achieved, things you've had especially positive feedback about, results that you're proud of, where you've made an impact. You can just talk about those things. And I think, too, if you're turned down, which hopefully you won't be, it's really important to ask your manager what it would take to get a raise in the future so that you have a plan going forward. And also, if you can't get an answer to that, if you're turned down for a raise and your manager can't tell you what it would take to get one, that's a big warning flag to you about what your future might look like there. So I would go into it looking at it not just as how can I get X dollar amount in my paycheck, but like let's really talk about what my future looks like here.
Mm-hmm. So when we are asking for a raise, say it's within the same job that we have, we just want a little more, or maybe a slightly more senior title, that comes with more money, but basically to do the same work. What is the percentage that we should expect, like generally speaking? What would be a reasonable amount to ask for?
So this can really vary. Something people are really surprised to hear is that the national average raise is something around 3%. So it's not super high. Now, that's the average, though, so that includes everyone. So hopefully you're above average, and you can aim for more than that. But it just kind of varies. This is a thing, I think, where you want to really do your research so that you have a good handle on the market pay for your work in your field and in your geographic area so that you're not undercutting yourself and you're also not asking for something that's unrealistically high. It is, as far as general guidelines, it's pretty hard to get like a 20% raise. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does, which is one reason why I try to shy away from giving actual numbers, because I don't want to discourage someone from going for that if they could actually get it. Mm-hmm. More often, a good raise is like in the 5 to 8% range.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Totally. I completely agree. I recently spoke with a young person who's new to the workforce, and they said to me, I feel like I perform at a higher level than my peers who are older than me. I save more money for my company. I'm more intelligent. I'm producing more overall. I feel, I've learned how much the other people are making. I plan to go and ask for, a 50% raise from my boss because that seems equitable given the output that I'm producing. What feedback would you have based on, the averages that you're seeing for someone that's asking for such a large raise internally, even if they are producing high output? What feedback would you have for them?
So it would be pretty unusual to get a 50% raise. It doesn't mean it could never happen in any circumstance, but I think you'd want to go into it understanding that would be a very, very unusual thing for your company to do. But it depends on what you're seeing. If you're able to put together data that shows that, everyone on your team is paid 50% more, and by the way, you happen to be the only woman, that's probably going to be more compelling than most of the other arguments that you could make. That would be a situation where I could see someone potentially getting a 50% raise, where I couldn't really in other cases.
Sure.
But it depends. If the person had, if their senior coworker ended up being unexpectedly out on medical leave for 6 months, and this person took on all of their projects and excelled and was going to continue in those areas of responsibility, that's more compelling for a higher dollar amount than just someone who's been performing excellently in their same basic job description. So I think 50% is unrealistically high. The person might deserve it. I don't think they're likely to get it. Mm-hmm. But you've got to look at that whole picture, because there's sometimes factors that can change that answer.
Yeah, and I think the example that you gave about, your coworker being out on medical leave and everything, it's almost like the argument there is that your job has changed, and that you're renegotiating based on new responsibilities.
That's exactly right. And that's the way to frame it.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what kinds of, and I know this question also, it's kind of not easy to give a specific answer, but what we were just talking about is internal raises. What kinds of pay increases have you seen, just generally speaking, for people who go to another company and negotiate a new salary somewhere else versus within their current company?
Yeah, you can get a huge jump in salary by changing jobs often. I once, earlier in my career, I think I more than doubled my salary in a single move. Now, I was moving from a low-paying nonprofit to one that was not so low-paying, but that's the kind of raise that you can almost never get internally. You're going to have to change jobs to get it. So I think the big thing is that when you're talking about salary expectations in that position, to not let them peg it to your old salary. So some employers really like to ask, what are you making now, or what is your salary history? I would advise people to avoid answering those questions if at all possible, because they'll use it to limit what they offer you. They're going to take that number and say, okay, we know she's willing to work for X amount, so we can offer her just a little bit of a bump up. So I would leave that totally out of the conversation and talk about what you're looking for as opposed to what you have been getting.
God, I totally agree. I'm so pro job seeker, and I really think that when you turn over your current salary information, you absolutely limit yourself completely, and you give up really unnecessary information.
Absolutely. And people feel like, well, they're asking, so I have to answer. And how do I not answer without coming across as rude? But, it's what you were saying earlier about answering the question that you wish you had been asked. So if someone says, what are you making? You don't have to answer that. You can say, well, what I'm looking for is a range of X to Y.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And when you have seen that answer given, does the person, the hiring manager or the HR manager, do they typically take the answer? Are they okay with it?
I think most people will accept that answer. There are some people, I think you see it particularly with external recruiters for some reason, who will push for more of an answer, or who will say, I can't move you forward without this information. And I mean, at that point, you have a few options. I'm sorry, the cat meowing in the background here. Do you want me to?
No, you're fine.
Do you want me to repeat that? Okay. At that point, you have a few options. You can hold firm. You can decide that you don't feel like you have enough options, and so you're going to give in and tell them. You can say that your salary is covered under your confidentiality agreement with your employer, if that's true, which it is for a lot of people. I think where it really becomes a problem is in automatic online application systems, where you're not dealing with a human, and it won't accept your application unless you fill that in.
Well, in that case, do you have any tips for us on the online application, what we could fill in when we're asked?
I mean, you can fill in a number that makes it obvious that you're declining to answer, but allows the computer to move you forward, like all ones or all zeros. You may run into trouble in doing that. You might get an employer who's annoyed that you handled it that way. So it really comes down to how firm are you willing to be on this? And that comes down to, what are your options? I mean, if you're in a position where you feel like you're a pretty good candidate, you're in a reasonably in-demand field, you have options, it's easier to take a stand on this kind of thing. If you're feeling more desperate, you're out of work, and your savings are running out, that might not be the hill that you die on.
No, I totally agree. You really have to think about how risky you can be, and the riskier that you are, the more likely you are going to be to turn that employer off. I will say, though, of all the interviews I've ever done, I always avoid this question. I've only ever one time had somebody get really upset about it. And it was, I was interviewing with a company that's a really cool company, but based out of New York. And the recruiter was, she, I think, was probably a native New York City person, and was kind of aggressive and, probably an awesome recruiter for the company. But, when I did not give the straight answer that she was looking for, she finally very directly said, Angela, if you do not answer this question, I will end this interview right now. And I just very respectfully said, I completely understand. I understand that it's part of your process. I really appreciate, you taking the time. And if anything changes, I would really love the opportunity to be considered.
And, good for you. Yeah. I'm so glad you held firm.
Oh, well, it was fine. But it was funny because I think it blew her away, because I think no other person had ever just been like, oh, thank you, and just kept cool, because she was getting very upset. Ironically, in this particular case, she called me back, I think like the next day or something, and they were really interested to talk to me. And she called me and said, well, we've decided to make an exception. But eventually you will have to answer this question. And I said, okay, thank you.
See, I think, well, I don't know if it was the case with her or not, but I think sometimes they will actually respect you for just very calmly and professionally declining to share information that, frankly, is none of their business.
Right. I mean, you just have to stand your ground and do what's comfortable to you. But again, you have to take into consideration how risky you can be. You said it perfectly. If you're unemployed and you're really struggling, this may not, it may be more important that you move forward than anything else.
That's right. But I think, too, when someone is in a position like the one you described being in, where you felt like you did have options, even if you don't care that much, it's a good thing to do, because you're helping out other people by creating a sense among employers that this is a question that they'll get pushback on. It's not appropriate for them to require it. So you're really helping out other people who maybe aren't in as strong of a position as with options as you are.
I completely agree. Well, so one thing that's really interesting about your background is that you've worked in sort of both the for-profit and nonprofit world. So you kind of have had some insight, from the hiring manager side on both of these things. So I'm curious, a lot of times part of our job search process is to decide which one of those worlds we should be working in. And if we're struggling to figure that out, do you have any tips or guidance that you might give us when we're trying to decide whether to go to for-profit or nonprofit?
Yeah, I think it depends on, well, of course, on what you want to do. Personally, I went into nonprofit work because I really wanted to make an impact in the world. I wanted my work every day to be making a difference on issues that I cared about. So if there's something that you're strongly motivated by like that, nonprofit work can be a good choice. But there's downsides to it, too. So, you really want the motivation to make up for the downsides. Many nonprofits, although not all, but many of them are going to be smaller, which can mean more dysfunction. They're going to have fewer resources and a tighter budget, so they might pay less. So you want to factor that into your thinking. I will say that's not true across the board. You can find nonprofits that are well-funded and pay competitively. It's just a matter of what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that I think is so important here is that there are plenty of ways to make a difference in the world doing work for a for-profit business as well. So I think my best advice in this regard is to get really clear about what's important to you in a job and in an employer and in your colleagues, and what will keep you happy and motivated and coming to work every day. And for most people, there's a whole range of what that could look like. It doesn't have to be one or the other. There's also this third option, which is to do for-profit work and use that to make it possible for you to volunteer in your off time or to otherwise do good work in the world on your own time, or even just to put yourself in a position where you can make donations to nonprofits that you care about. So I think it doesn't have to be an either or, which is important for people to remember.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. So you used a word in your answer that I think is really an important one, which is dysfunction. I have found a lot of times that when someone is looking to move from for-profit to nonprofit, that in their mind, they picture that nonprofit's going to be, it's all going to be great. We're all going to do good work, which it is good work, right? But I found that they often don't typically picture that dysfunctional piece.
Yes. I think people expect really good work-life balance and a relaxed kind of vibe, and maybe you can get that.
Sure.
But they might actually expect very long hours, and especially if it's a small organization. I don't think this is something about nonprofits. I think this is something about small organizations.
Right.
They're just more likely to have dysfunction and weird practices and things that will make you unhappy. Whereas if you're in a larger organization, they have their own brands of dysfunction too, but they tend to be more manageable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I totally agree. I think nonprofits are incredible, but I think it's important that people really understand, whichever organization they go into, what they are getting into, because I've just seen a lot of people be very disappointed after they make a switch.
Yeah, I think with any switch, you want to go in with your eyes wide open, and you want to do your due diligence and talk to people who have worked there, who maybe aren't still there, but are more willing to give you sort of a brutally honest look at it, rather than being guided by what you think it will be like.
Yeah, and in terms of pay, you mentioned that different nonprofits, some of them may not pay super well. Do you have any suggestions where we might look to learn how much a certain nonprofit might pay?
Yeah, this is actually a great thing about nonprofits, is that there's sometimes more transparency than there is at a for-profit company. So there is a website called guidestar.org, which so every year nonprofits have to file tax forms that include information about their most highly paid people. And guidestar.org has them all there. So you can go there and you can look at these tax forms and you can see some of their salary structure. You won't see all of it, but if you go there and you see that their five highest paid people are all making $50,000 to $60,000, and you can know that you coming in a junior or mid-level position, you're probably not going to be making that much, for instance. So that could be really good information to have. So it won't necessarily tell you here is the salary, but it will give you kind of a framework that they're using.
Mm-hmm. I love GuideStar. It's my favorite for nonprofits. I will say the one thing I learned, I had the opportunity to coach a preacher on negotiation a few years ago. And what I learned, which I'm sure you know, is that I think it's nonprofits that are associated with sort of religion in any way are not required to disclose that same level of data, the tax data that has how much their CEO is making and that kind of thing.
Ooh, I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so it was an interesting process, in particular with this person, because it's a very taboo topic within the sort of religious space among preachers. They don't discuss how much they are each making together, so they can't ask each other. But then there's this tax data is not available because they're kind of protected legally, and so it's very it's a really interesting space, that negotiation space for preachers. And in this particular case, and I won't go on forever about it, but I believe that once the preacher has negotiated their salary, at some organizations, the salary is then presented to the congregation, and they let everyone kind of know what that person is going to be paid. So it's just very, very public and kind of awkward.
That's so interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Love awkwardness. I think, too, though, you get such valuable cultural information by the way that an organization handles salary. So if they're playing coy and there's all this weirdness and tension around it, you can expect that there's going to be weirdness and tension around it once you're working there, too. And that's going to have repercussions on things like asking for a raise or having your work appropriately compensated going forward. So I think people need to look at it through sort of a wide lens and realize that however they handle the salary discussions, they're telling you really important things about themselves.
That's right. And again, like you said earlier, sometimes they tell you that you don't really want to work there.
Yep, that's right. And you have to be open to realizing that that's the message that you're getting. And if you're just focused on getting an offer, you can miss that really important message.
No, completely, totally agree. Well, Alison, you have given us so much good insight today. If we want to go and learn more about Ask a Manager, where should we look?
Yeah, so Ask a Manager is at askamanager.org online, and it's a daily advice column where I'm answering readers' questions on all sorts of workplace and job site issues. So I definitely encourage people to come check it out.
Oh, that's great. Well, Alison, thank you so much for joining me.
Angela, thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to ensure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.